Okay, good evening, folks. I think we'll make a start. It's around about 6 o'clock at the moment. I'm Paul Kirkbride, Professor of Forensic Science at Flinders University, and I'll be acting as your MC for this evening. Firstly, however, Flinders University acknowledges that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we pay respect to elders past and present. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land. We acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And some other official duties before we start. If we need to be removed from the premises for fire or something of that nature, the idea is to go through the sliding glass doors that you would have already come through and go to the right, and we'll be able to go down some stairs to Victoria Square. If the need arises and you need the toilets, go through the same door, but don't go down to Victoria Square. Instead, turn left and you will find some toilets down the end of that little corridor there. Okay, so the event introduction. Welcome and thank you for joining Flinders for this research lecture series entitled Brave, as you can see on the board there. Brave is not just a reflection of the research that Flinders University pursues today, it's a call to action from our institution's earlier days. You might know that our founding Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Carmel, explained his ambitions for Flinders University in the quote, "We want to experiment and experiment bravely." And this is evident in our research and discoveries that we are sharing with the world for the greater good, we hope. Tonight, we're aiming to provide insight into understanding the health implications of living within a home that's been used to produce or consume methamphetamine. And what better researcher to share some of her results with us than Dr. Jackie Wright. Jackie completed her PhD at Flinders University and focused on public health exposures and the health effects of former Clan drug laboratories and other premises that are contaminated with methamphetamine residues. She's continuing her work as an adjunct researcher with Flinders University and provides advice on a range of issues associated with meth-contaminated properties and clandestine drug laboratories as well to local councils, police, health regulators, real estate and other industry bodies. Jackie's been involved in the development of a number of national guidelines, including the EN Health Position Statement and the Australian Crime Commission guidelines for the remediation of clandestine drug laboratories. So without further ado from me, I'd like to introduce Jackie to go through her presentation. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much for that, and hopefully this will all work. Do I have to turn it on? No, here we go. I'm just too enthusiastic. Okay, so there we go. We're good. Okay, so just a bit of a quick outline of what I'm going to cover in the lecture today is just a bit of background about methamphetamine and really what are the issues and what's the fuss all about, why are we talking about this. I'm going to touch a little bit on the Australian guidelines, what they're based on, some of the issues that sit within those guidelines, the current research that we're doing, particularly highlighting a number of case studies to try and give you a snapshot of some of the things that we're seeing with these particular properties. I've been trying to give you a bit of a diverse picture of those. And then out of that, what are some of the issues going forward that we see coming out of some of the research? And obviously where to next is, hopefully we'll cover that as well. So just a really, really brief history of amphetamines. Back in the 1800s, late 1800s, it was first synthesised. It wasn't until the early 1900s where a much more potent version was actually developed in Japan, and it became much more prevalent and much easier to manufacture. It then became quite widely used for everything. You could buy it and you could use it for asthma, depression, weight loss, bedwetting, all sorts of things. Apparently it cured everything, so you could use it for everything. It was also used in World War II for the fighter planes, and also a bunch of other soldiers used it to keep awake and keep alert. So it was used a lot in World War II. We then started seeing a lot of abuse of those drugs, and it became essentially declared as a controlled substance and prevented from being used that way, particularly in the 1970s. The first clandestine drug labs, which were picked up in the US in San Francisco back in 1962, first one in Australia was in Sydney in 1976. So the illicit drug manufacture of it has been going around for quite a while. As far as its use is concerned, really became much more prevalent in Australia in the 2000s, from 2000 onwards, where particularly ice became more prevalent in our society, and it continues on. As far as manufacturing meth is concerned, I'm not telling you how to do that. The internet's a fabulous resource for doing that, so you can just go there and have a look. I'm just trying to give you a bit of a snapshot of really what the manufacturer is looking to do. So you start with your pseudoephedrine. It's a simple reduction to get to methamphetamine by stripping off the hydroxy group. This is a really simplified version of what it is that we're doing. So you start with your cold and flu tablets, a bunch of alcohols and solvents. There's a couple of different reduction methods that are most commonly used in Australia. The hypo method, which is more common on the eastern states and also here in South Australia, Nazi birch method, more common in Western Australia. Essentially, what they're doing is getting it down to producing what's called a meth base, which is an oily substance. It's not the form of meth that you can use, it's quite caustic. So that's not what you actually want to use as a drug user. So you actually have to form the salt. And that's done by this salting out process. So essentially what you're doing is you're bubbling through hydrochloric gas through it to actually create the salt. And that process of bubbling through the meth base creates and aerosolises the meth into respirable sized droplets that pretty much you can inhale while you're cooking it, but also spreads throughout the property, and that deposits on everything. So it sits on all the surfaces, the hard surfaces, the soft surfaces, penetrates into the soft surfaces, so carpets and curtains and lounges and all those sorts of things. So these residues then get spread around the property. There's a whole bunch of other chemicals obviously that are used that produce gases, solvents, produce VOCs and all sorts of things. But I suppose the focus of what I'm talking to you about today relates to those meth residues. Those residues are also produced when smoking. So when you're smoking ice, it's not burning the ice, it's actually heating it to create a vapour or an aerosol version of it, and that's what you inhale. But that aerosol version is also the same sort of meth that then deposits back out of the air, back into all those surfaces as well. So both these actually end up resulting in contamination with those meth residues. So how might you be exposed to these meth residues in a property? So I have my nice little property. So with our meth contamination on all the various different surfaces and materials, because it's on all those surfaces and materials, the most common way that people get exposed to it is it gets onto their skin. You touch things. So obviously skin, dermal absorption, particularly kids, they'll stick their hands in their mouths, they'll stick objects in their mouths. The residues are quite transferable, so they'll transfer off surfaces onto hands, onto objects, then into the mouth. So ingestion is also really important. And one of the other things I found out, chatting to one of my case studies, he's an older gentleman and he fessed up that, you know, he's probably getting a decent dose because he chews his fingernails all the time. So he has that habit of sticking his hands in his mouth after he's been touching things all the time as well. So it's not just kids, it's us adults as well. As far as the residues are concerned, they can also be present in dust. If the property hasn't been remediated, they can be present in that dust that's stirred up by just moving around the house. But also vacuuming is a great source of spreading it around and putting it back into the air. So it can be inhaled that way or moved around. And when we're talking about residues on a surface, we're talking about testing it by collecting a surface wipe sample. So that's the little picture I've got up here. So what they do is they get a swab, which is a methanol or an isopropanol swab, and you basically rub it over 100 square centimetres, 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres, to lift off whatever residues are present in that. So the measurement that's done is a surface residue test, and it's typically the mass of methamphetamine that is present in that 100 square centimetres. So it's most commonly reported is in micrograms per 100 square centimetres. So whenever we're talking about numbers here, we're talking about micrograms per 100 square centimetres as a surface residue measurement. As far as these surface residues are concerned, in manufacture, what do we know about these particular properties? A lot of them are in residential areas. A lot of the manufacturing methods that are done, particularly for user-based manufacture, so people who cook for themselves or just for their mates, they're quite dirty, and there's some that are much dirtier than others. Sometimes there may be some small cooks using some so-called cleaner methods. I know when I was speaking to some people in New Zealand, they're talking about doing really small personal cooks in pressure cookers. Oh yes, that's really clean. It's like, I don't think so, but they call them cleaner methods. But we can also have lots of larger cooks, frequent cooks, dirty methods, all those sorts of things. So one of the things that I've done is sort of look at some of the data that's collected from known meth labs in Australia. So we've got 100 properties that have actually been busted by police that have been tested to look at, well, what are we seeing in some of these properties? So a lot of them come from West Australia, New South Wales and so forth. There's a poor representation of Queensland, purely because of access to their data. They weren't so helpful. But they're most commonly using the hypo method, and there are a lot of them are user-based labs in Queensland, which is very much similar to South Australia. So I'm quite comfortable that the data we've got from South Australia will probably be consistent with what we see going on for those labs in Queensland. So as far as where they're coming from, a lot of them are in houses, so public housing and urban areas, and various different methods. Obviously, the hypophosphorus method, Nazi birch method are the most common here in Australia. As far as where manufacture is more likely to happen, you get slightly different pictures depending on where you're getting your information from. When you look at information that comes from the police reports that are provided, it sort of suggests the kitchen, maybe a shed, bathroom, are more common areas to do manufacture. When you actually go and have a chat with the cooks, there's a whole range of weird, wonderful places they like to manufacture. Cars, caravans, someone else's home, which I thought was always interesting. But he was quite honest. I mean, he said, I'm not going to do it in my house. I'd prefer to do it in someone else's house. It's like, great. But anyway, usually it's most commonly done at home, their home, whether they're renting or they own it. And for them, bathroom, shed are the most common. The kitchen is not far behind. So slightly different pictures that you get from them, but essentially bathrooms, kitchens, sheds, those sorts of places is where you get most of the manufacture happening. As far as levels are concerned, there's quite a range of concentrations levels of surface residues that are reported. This is a log scale, so it's very hard to picture it otherwise. It gives you a range of the sort of lows to highs. I don't expect you to read all of this, and there's no test at the end. But it's essentially to show you that there is quite a range of levels that you see in these properties. The blue line is the current Australian guideline for residential homes. So that's 0.5 is there. So as you can see, there's some properties that have the lower numbers that are below that, but the bulk of them have numbers that are quite significantly higher than that. So what we find from these properties is that the method and the scale actually does matter as far as the residue levels that we find in these properties. If we look at the data that we've got from that 100 properties that have been busted, about 50% of the residues are up to that 10 micrograms per 100 square centimetres. The rest of them are sort of ranging up to 4,000, so there's quite a big range in some of those others. There's some data that comes out of the US from some single cooks of the hypo method and the Nazi birch method that look at just what comes from just one single cook, and it's sort of heading up to 900 just from one single cook can deposit on surfaces close by to that cook. So there's a potential for a lot to be deposited. Now, as far as use is concerned, again, predominantly in residential areas, so this is the smoking of ice. Again, there is data from one cook that suggests, just one cook, one smoke gives you 0.02, which is not a lot, But once you start having these called smokehouses or frequent users, you can start building up those residues to get to levels that are in excess of that guideline of 0.5. And certainly some of the properties I've been dealing with, which are known to have just use in them, have up to 20. So you can certainly accumulate enough over time because they're not going away. So that question about how long do these things last in these properties? Again, this is one of the things that's not really well studied and some things that we need to get more data on. But when we actually look at the information that we've got from these real properties, we're not seeing those residues change over many years. I've got some properties that the numbers haven't changed over 10 years. They haven't been remediated, but the numbers aren't going anywhere. They're not declining. They haven't changed. So they are lasting for a long period of time. So as far as numbers of properties that might be contaminated, I've got a few more statistics next, but one of the companies that have been doing a bit more, I suppose, testing of properties, depending on suspicion, so it is a bit of a biased data set. 50% of those properties they've been testing, and they've done 1,500 now in 2018, 50% of those have hit in positives. So again, it is a biased data set, because people are suspicious that there might have been some strange drug activity going on in their property, or they're unwell, so they're trying to find out why they're unwell. As far as property numbers, so the prevalence of drug labs in Australia comes from the Crime Commission. They issue a report every year about how many drug labs they seize each year and this is for the ones for methamphetamines. So as you can see, it's sort of had a nice steady increase, and then from 2010 to about 2014-ish, we sort of consistently had around 700, maybe heading towards 800 a year being busted. And there's been a bit of a decline, 15, 16, 17. The states are in there, but don't expect you to read all the numbers again. Queensland is this grey thing in the middle. They have a lot of those small user-based drug labs, which is why they have such a large number of them. New South Wales and Victoria, which are these ones at the bottom, we tend to have much bigger bikie gang run labs, so there tend to be less of them but producing a lot more. South Australia is this yellow one, and of all the states, it's one of the ones that hasn't declined in 15, 16, 17. So up to 2017, there was 81 in that 16, 17 year. So that hasn't changed very much. But certainly that's what we see as far as the ones police have busted. Based on some of the other research that's been done, which I won't go into, we really think that's actually only picking up about 5 to 10% of the actual number of labs that are around each year. So you're looking at sort of 10 to 20-fold higher than this each year as far as properties that are being potentially affected by drug manufacture. So what about use? This whole thing about smoking of ice and just some of the statistics that comes from, smoking of ice and use of methamphetamine. Apparently 1 in 70 people have used methamphetamine in the last year, and out of this group of people, it's not me. So look at your neighbour. And of the 57% of those recent users, you prefer to use ice rather than the powder, the injectable form. So one of the things that we've certainly seen since the 2000s is really a greater prevalence of the use of ice compared to injecting amphetamines. So that means that smoking of ice is the way that the use contaminates properties. I know in the N-Health position statement that's on clandestine drug labs, there was an estimate in there about numbers of properties that might be contaminated from use, and it's in the tens of thousands. We just don't have a good handle on how much people are using and how much people are actually smoking in these properties. And how much they're sharing it around with their friends in their houses, so we just don't know. So from a public health perspective, we clearly know drug use. The actual drug use, there's health problems to using methamphetamine. But what we're talking about here is what's left behind, those drug residues that are left behind in the house from manufacturer use. Now, it is an illegal activity, so it's not something they're going to tell you when you buy your property or you're going to be able to find out really easily. And the people who are coming to live in these homes after the event, they never chose to do the drugs. They weren't the ones manufacturing, they're not the ones using. They never chose to have any exposure to these drugs. Almost all the homes that certainly I see and I deal with that are well after the fact, so police have already done their thing, they've removed evidence, somebody's cleaned up, made the house representable for sale or for rent. They're all really clean, neat and tidy. Occasionally they're a bit messy because they do an average job at tidying up, but there's no visible signs. So if you think about the pictures that you see of drug labs that are busted by police, and there's quite a few going around at the moment because of your super labs that have been busted yesterday, you know, that shows a whole bunch of equipment and stains and powder residues and all sorts of things. Those aren't present in these homes. These look like normal homes. So you can't see that the property is contaminated. And people living in these properties, there's quite a number of them that actually report health effects. So that's part of the reason why, you know, we've been doing this research, is to really understand what's going on with these properties. Apart from the health effects, there's other issues that go along with these properties. So a lot of people feel really deceived about having been put in that position. So either felt like they've been lied to about the status of the property, or they suffer property loss, so they lose their possessions in the house because they're contaminated, or they lose their property. I know one particular family has actually lost their property back to the bank because they borrowed 95% to get their property. So they didn't have any extra money, moved in, found out it was a contaminated property from manufacture. They had to move out. They lived in their brother's garage because that's all they could do with 2 kids. But they had no money and no financial resources to borrow any more money to remediate the property. So they had to lose their property to the bank. So for them, it was a huge, huge loss. There's also quite a financial cost to community, particularly when you look at the public housing sphere. So the Australian guidelines, we do have Australian guidelines for the assessment and remediation of clandestine drug labs. These are health-based guidelines. There's a whole bunch of information in there about how you should do testing and all that sort of stuff, so I'm not going to talk about that bit. I'm actually going to talk about the numbers themselves, the guidelines. So they're health-based numbers that are designed to protect the most vulnerable, being a small child for a residential setting, and obviously it's an adult for commercial. They were developed sort of published 2011 based on the information that we knew at the time that was put together. And when I was working on this, it was sort of the catalyst to really start looking into this a lot more, because there's so many data gaps that we didn't understand and so many disconnects between how we derive these and what health effects are being reported. So that's sort of the catalyst for doing some of this work. So when you think about any guidelines, they always have an underlying purpose. Our N-Health guidelines, we have guidelines that are set by the National Environment Protection Measures or councils for various different things, same as our drinking water guidelines, contaminated land guidelines and so forth. They're intended to be protective as sensitive subpopulations present reasonable worst case, so that if you have some exceedance, some minor exceedance of those guidelines, it shouldn't represent an unacceptable risk or present a significant risk to health. There should be a buffer in there to allow for some movement around, because testing, we're using testing methods to make a decision whether you meet them or you don't meet them. That testing is never great, so there's got to be a bit of buffer in there. So the Crime Commission guidelines were developed with the same sort of philosophy, but what we do find is that we start seeing health effects not much above the guideline in this particular case. So the guidelines themselves say they're risk-based. What they do is they look at and they calculate the intake of methamphetamine by young children, in this particular case for residential homes. They then compare that intake against a safe level. So that safe level, the tolerable daily intake, the tox value for methamphetamine, what is an acceptable amount that can be exposed, and we work out what surface residue number allows us to meet that safe level. So there are a bunch of assumptions that sit in there that don't really ring that true anymore. As far as exposure is concerned, they were developed assuming that remediation would happen, that they're remediation guidelines. So the residues, whatever might be left behind, would actually not include dislodgeable, so ones that are really mobile. They would have been cleaned up. So inhalation was never considered. We can't actually assume that that is the case when remediation hasn't been done. We actually don't know a lot about inhalation exposures. It's not something we've looked at very well. There are some methods now to measure it, but we really haven't looked at it very much. And it's one of the data gaps that sits there. As far as exposure is concerned, in the guidelines it's assumed that it's actually a short-term exposure, that the residues will continue to go away, they're not going to hang around, and so exposure is assumed for a short term, as is toxicity is a short-term subchronic toxicity value. But what we're seeing in properties that aren't remediated, that's actually not the case. They're hanging around for years and years and would be considered to be chronic. So really that part of it is no longer true. The toxicity of methamphetamine, not going to go through this in great detail, but there's a whole bunch of information that we do know about methamphetamine. So behavioural effects, cardiovascular effects, effects on the brain, endocrine effects, reproductive developmental effects, particularly at high levels. But for actually looking at chronic effects, there is some information from animal studies. There's some older data from human studies back in the days when you were allowed to take it because it was a bit of fun and you could take it to solve every problem under the sun. Some of that data, and there's also some data from studies that come from prescribed uses. So side effects from taking it from dealing with obesity, bedwetting in children, ADHD children. So some of that's where the data comes from for doing chronic type exposures, and it's not a great data set. So as far as setting that safe level, there's really only two studies that are around that have been published. One's from Colorado, one's from California. The Colorado one uses data from the animal studies. The Californian one uses the information from the human studies. Again, it's normal. People interpret the studies quite differently sometimes. But in particular for methamphetamine, there are quite significant differences between the way rats, which is the main animal that is used in these studies, between rats and humans. That means it's really not a good... Using the rat studies for methamphetamine is not good. It doesn't provide a good indication of what those effects are. So it's really underestimating what the exposures and what the effects are at various different levels. Won't go through this in any great detail, but one of the things I wanted to point out was when you're setting these levels, you get the information from the study, and then you look at it, they're both subchronic, and then they apply these things called uncertainty factors, and that's a normal part of setting any tox value. It's to convert what we understand from the original source study to what's applicable for us as humans, and to cover the variability of what goes on with human populations. So they're normal as part of setting these sorts of guidelines. So the Crime Commission guideline used the Californian tox data, but one of the things, there's some outstanding questions that sit in there about whether it's chronic, subchronic exposures, and also some of those adverse effects that are used, or some of the studies that are used, are using doses that are therapeutic doses. So they're from those studies. So they're not looking at doses that relate to us being exposed in a house when we're not intending to take those drugs. I won't go through that, but there are a bunch more new studies that are more chronic studies that should actually be considered. As far as exposure is concerned, again, it's a subchronic exposure and the assumption that remediation has occurred. As far as dermal is concerned, it accounts for about 80 to 95% of what is taken up by kids in particular, and then the rest of it's ingestion. Again, dermal, we actually understand more now than what we did when we derived these guidelines, because essentially we're assuming what we've measured in this 100 square centimetre square represents what we're actually going to touch throughout the whole day. And it might be in that room, or maybe in this room, someone will come in and they'll test here, and they might test 100 square centimetres over there. So how does that reflect what we touch all day, every day, now that we also understand better that methamphetamine sits on different surfaces differently? So what's on a A plastic surface is quite different from a glass surface, is different from carpet. So it doesn't really reflect very well what we're actually being exposed to. Then we assume a whole bunch of things about how we might be exposed, how often we do things, how often we stick our hands in our mouths, and how easily it is for meth to transfer from surfaces to skin and so forth. In the guidelines, we assumed it was the same for pesticides because we actually didn't have any data. There is data now that actually says more gets transferred and more gets into the skin. So we wanted to do a reality check because that's the theory of how we work out how much we're exposed to things. But the reality is we're actually seeing effects at, as I say, not much above guidelines. So what's going on? We do need to actually come back and see what's going on with these sorts of situations. So that's some of the research that I've been doing is really, it's an epidemiological type of research where we're actually looking at people, real case studies, understanding how they got into that situation. Is it manufacture? Is it use? Do we know that? Sometimes we don't. So who's been exposed, how they've been exposed, what health effects we're seeing. Getting evidence of those health effects is really important. What methamphetamine levels are in that property. So, and again, I want to be able to use the industry standard way of testing it because that's what we relate to and how it's used in real life. So we have to get all that information, and in some cases we're actually characterising some of those exposures by collecting hair and doing hair analysis. Not in every case, because sometimes I don't see these people till well after they've left the house, or sometimes they're blokes with really short hair and they've been out of the house for way too long. So it's really not helpful to do that. And one of the things I'm also doing is following up with a number of the case studies to seeing how long these health effects last after they've moved out of that property. Do they get resolved? So I'm just going to run through some case studies just to give you a snapshot of some of the issues that come up. And every case study I've got is quite unique and different in many ways. So what I'm giving you is a bit of an overview. So this is a rural property in Victoria. 2013, police actually seized equipment in the shed, and they issued a notice to the local council to say it was potentially a clandestine drug lab and that they needed to deal with it. So that's the right thing. That's what police normally do. Then council did the right thing. They issued a notice to the owner to assess and remediate. That's, again, what they're supposed to do. What they didn't do is check that the owner was actually the offender, because, of course, the offender doesn't actually care less. He needed money, so August of that year he sold the house. That notice that remained active was never followed up by council. It was also never found doing any property checks. So property checks by the homeowners or future homeowners and also their bank never found an active notice that basically said the property was uninhabitable. So October that year they moved in. It wasn't until May the following year where the council fessed up that they had an outstanding notice on the property. In fact, the only first contact this family had with the council was they rocked up on the doorstep with their lawyers, always a good sign. They then said, well, you know, it was just in the shed, so it's okay. They actually issued on their letterhead, without doing any testing, it's all right, it was just in the shed, they just found equipment, so your property's safe. They hadn't tested anything at this stage. Then council came back and did some preliminary testing. So this is some testing using what's called an immunoassay test where you, like a pregnancy test, I just call it a pregnancy test for houses, and essentially looking at whether meth is above a certain threshold. Is it above the guideline? So they did some testing in the shed and all the places they sampled in the shed were positive. So yes, the shed was pregnant. They sent another letter, God bless them. They said, oh, the contamination's in the shed. Don't worry about it. Just keep your kids out of the shed, but your house is fine. So, but we need to do some extra testing with the lab to see what numbers we get. So they did some extra testing in October. So one of the things you might notice is there's quite a bit of time that goes on here. Council's not the quickest. They did some testing, got the lab analysis done. Fortunately, the tester was smart enough to go, well, there might be some residue transfer, shed to house. Let's see what's in the house. So these are the methamphetamine residue levels in the house and in the shed. Remember the guideline's 0.5, so quite contaminated. We also tested their tractors in the actual yards. And inside the tractors where people actually sit and use the tractors, 50 to 400. So quite contaminated. They had to move out of the house once they got these results, which they didn't get until March 2015. They left the house, couldn't take any of their possessions with them at all. October this year is basically where they're up to now. They have just settled with council about getting their property to be able to do what they need to remediate it and get back on their property. So that's 3.5 years. Okay, so it's quite a significant impact on these people. As far as living in the house is concerned, yes, there were health effects by all the members of the family. In particular, the youngest child, there were respiratory problems, behavioural changes, which were probably the most noticeable. The symptoms were very similar to an inattentive ADHD type of thing, a lot of sleep problems, trouble sleeping, but also really vivid and crazy dreams, and unexplained rashes. So the other members of the family also had similar health effects, but to a lesser extent. I have been following up with this particular family about how long it's taking to resolve those things. Except for the behavioural changes, all the others were gone within a couple of months of moving out of the property. The behavioural changes have taken about 18 months for him to be back to the same behaviours and getting the same scores on his behavioural assessment as he did beforehand. For this particular case, we also looked at hair analysis. So we looked at, for all members of the family, what was in basically the external hair wash, so what might have been deposited on the outside of the hair and what's incorporated into the hair. These are the levels for methamphetamine, so it was detected in all of them. Trace levels for the father. But as you can see, the highest levels for the young boys, lower for the daughter, who was aged 11, then the mother, and then the father. And really that reflected the exposures that go on in that house. The boys were typical boys. They roll on the floor, they touch the walls, they don't wash their hands, all those sorts of things. So you expect them to actually have more in their system than the others. So very much what we saw in their hair reflected their exposure behaviour, I suppose. The mum was the only one that had a detection of meth in her hair wash. And when I spoke to her again, it's like, I'm not sure where that's come from. And then she fessed up because I collected these samples a week after they moved out of the house. She's a very house-proud lady. She didn't want to leave her house untidy. So she'd been going back and been cleaning. God bless her. We told her to stop. She did stop, and she stopped going back in there. So being in that property quite clearly was a continual source of contamination. If we just look very quickly at these are the levels, the horizontal lines going down. You can see how they reduce. These vertical lines are the range of methamphetamine reported in other published studies. So these are drug-exposed kids in the US, kids that live with drug users, children and adults from active meth labs in New Zealand, long-term adult drug users and adult workplace testing, so that recreational and other drug use sort of stuff. So certainly the kids are in that range. These ones don't go lower than this point because that's the standard cutoff for doing hair analysis for all those sorts of purposes. We went to the limit of reporting for the method because we wanted to look at environmental exposures, which is why we looked at lower. So another case study, this is a public housing property where we know it had a former history of drug use. No manufacture was ever done in this property. The mother, a carer and a teenage daughter moved into the property. It's a rental property. They lived there for about 3 years. Previous to these guys moving in, it was actually rented by their grandmother, and she passed away, which is why they moved in. So they actually had a whole bunch of health problems upon moving in that house. They actually put them down to the stress of grieving their mother and moving house and all that sort of stuff. But after 3 years and continual health problems, the housing authority finally tested the property for them, and it was contaminated with methamphetamines. They had to move out without their possessions. These are the levels that were reported in the property. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of variability on what's actually on the building structure itself, various different levels on the walls and so forth. So this is the one that has up to 20 micrograms per 100 square centimetres. These are various different possessions that they have in the property. Some are more contaminated than others. It really depends on the materials, where it was and all that sort of stuff. So not something you can easily predict. So all the members of that family actually experienced significant respiratory effects, skin rashes, sleep problems, behavioural issues. That they all experienced those. One of the interesting things was the mother. She's interesting character. She has an interesting past. About 10 years ago, she was actually a drug user. And one of the things she said was the effects that she felt in that house were very much like withdrawal from methamphetamine, but the really crappy bad bits. There was no highs, there's nothing good about it, but it's just like continual withdrawal. That's how she described the health effects in that property, which was really quite interesting. We did do hair testing on the daughter and picked up trace levels of methamphetamine in her, so she was a 13-year-old daughter. And again, with these particular people, those health issues resolved within 6 months of moving out of the house. So with those particular case studies, one of the things I did do was actually do a bit of a baselining of, what intakes can we estimate from the hair analysis, and how does that relate to what we understand about exposure and stuff. So it's not really, great to try and work out your actual intake from hair numbers, because it's not a great hair dose response relationship or anything like that. But it was a bit of a back of the envelope sort of thing. So it's a bit rough, but it was just to see if we're getting close to the mark. So when we do that and we look at the levels of hair, levels in the hair, particularly of the kids, it suggests that we're sort of 300 to 8,000 times higher than what you'd expect from if you met the guideline. Whereas if you look at the surface residue numbers that come from that property or those properties, we're really only seeing exceedances up to 40 times the guideline. So there's some disconnect in there, something that we're missing. I know this is a bit rough, but it's just an indication of, are we underestimating some of this? Just another case study. This is a rental property in Queensland. These particular people moving from Melbourne to the Gold Coast. Particularly bad time to try and do that was when the Commonwealth Games was on, so there was such a shortage of rental properties, so they actually agreed to a property sight unseen, promised by the agent that it was clean, neat and tidy, but it actually wasn't. It was just messy, but no indication of any drug use or anything like that. So in May of this year, a SACS staff member from the real estate agent actually told them that the previous tenant was evicted from the premises for meth use. So they also said that both the real estate agent and the property owner knew that it was probably contaminated with meth, and they did no assessment, no remediation, they just let these people move in. They actually called Queensland Health at that point to try and find out what they needed to do, what could they possibly do, because this was not busted by police or anything. They were really quite concerned. They had no idea. They gave them no advice, which was really unhelpful. So they organised doing some testing in the property. They ended up with levels up to 10 in that property. They did have health problems that pretty much started from within days and weeks of moving into the house. The mother particularly was very much affected by headaches. She actually went to hospital 3 times with migraines. She'd never had headaches or migraines before. She had cognitive issues, respiratory issues, rashes, not sleeping, tiredness, all that sort of stuff. Again, her son had rashes, respiratory problems, all those sorts of things as well. Again, they had to move out of the house, not taking their possessions with them. And again, their health problems are resolving. Not all of the behavioural issues have been resolved yet. For them, they're actually really, really angry because they have information that they were lied to by the real estate agent and the property owner. They're trying to figure out if they can get criminal charges laid against them because they have harmed their family. And their insurance doesn't cover any of their possessions, so they're really struggling at the moment. Unit blocks. A couple of unit blocks as a couple of examples. This particular case, there was manufacture occurring in one unit. Tenants became really concerned because they found out that it was manufacture occurring. They were worried about their properties, which is fair enough. So the strata actually engaged 2 different testing companies to test the property. I include this to sort of show the difference between testing companies. So the actual unit itself where the manufacturing occurred, sort of had up to 60. Only one of the companies got access to test that. And that's not unusual. 3 of the units that were adjacent to that were most affected. And then there's the common areas, which were also affected. So company 1, which collected quite a number of samples, got a range up to sort of 3.6, 1.9. Company 2, much lower, sort of order of magnitude lower. The question is why? These companies pick different types of surfaces to sample, which we know have different levels on them. These guys only collected a small number of samples. They collected many more samples. But it goes to show you who you engage to do the testing and their knowledge of testing materials to look for contamination and whether it's present becomes quite important. So you'd make quite different decisions based on this data set versus this one, because this is below the guideline of 0.5. This one's not. Okay, so it really does highlight that there are differences, and getting experienced people is really important. There's another one. Again, this is also different. This lady, middle-aged lady, moved into a private rental property. It appears over time that she's realised that the real estate agent and the owner had been involved in manufacturing in the unit that she moved into, but also continued to manufacture in other units while she was living there. She complained of all sorts of gases and smells and strange things going on, but no one paid any attention because it was the real estate agent and the owner. She had multiple chemical sensitivity herself, so she was actually really significantly affected health-wise. The number of health issues that she had is huge. When you tested the property, up to 107, which is really quite elevated, consistent with what you'd expect in a meth lab. For her, we looked at the hair sample for her. We picked up really quite high levels of methamphetamine, but also amphetamine, MDMA and MDA also detected in her hair. They're really at sort of user levels, or the levels that you see in people that are actually where manufacturing is occurring, which was quite unusual. We're not seeing that in a lot of adults, but this particular case, there was quite clearly manufacturing going on. She did contact police a number of times to try and get some action, but nothing has happened to date. She did get a lot of harassment from the real estate agent and from other people in the property because they knew that she was trying to report on them. She lost her possessions, no insurance, no compensation. She's trying to seek resolution. Last of my case studies, rental property in South Australia. They moved in 2016, adults and son though were quite unwell in the properties. There was quite a strong smell, unable to concentrate and so forth. They thought it might have been mould because there was reports the property had a grow house in it about 10 years ago. So the property owner actually got treated for mould even though they didn't really find anything. Then they were still sick. They still couldn't understand it. So they got testing done for methamphetamine. The pregnancy test came up positive. So they did some other tests. And again, it came back up to, the highest was 2. So it's not really highly contaminated, but it's certainly got contamination present. So they did report it. What they did in this particular case, it's never been busted by police, but they did report it to the council, who actually issued a notice, which was actually quite interesting because it doesn't happen on these properties very much. So they actually lost a whole bunch of their possessions. And one of the interesting things was they wanted to get compensation through the Tenancies Act, but the Act in South Australia talks about cleanliness, not health and safety or safety and wellbeing. It talks about cleanliness, and the interpretation of SACAT is that you can't see it, so it's not unclean. Go figure. Anyway, so just a snapshot of those case studies plus some of the others. Again, we're seeing consistent health effects. They all go away when they're out of the property. There's a number of them that we're seeing this consistent pattern. Again, consistent type of health effects that we see across the board in both children and adults. There are certainly people that I deal with that don't have any health effects. So it's not everyone that lives in one of these properties has health effects, but certainly a significant number of them do. So just some of the issues which I'll quickly run through in the last few minutes before I get kicked off. There's no requirements to disclose past drug history. There's no requirements to test rental properties or properties being sold. When police bust a lab, that's when notification occurs. In South Australia, Western Australia, that system is actually quite robust. Many other states it's not, okay? So lots of properties don't get dealt with. A lot of the time, most of the properties that we see aren't notified by police. They're actually found out to be contaminated and have no police notification. That's where most of it sits. There's issues to do with owners, real estate agents being aware of potential for contamination, and there's no way of forcing them to deal with it when it's not been busted by police. So, and of course, owners have the responsibility to pay for this, and they want to do the cheapest job they can. There's no big business or government paying for this. It's there coming out of their pockets. So, you know, they don't want to have to pay. I've already talked about the guidelines and some of the disconnects that sit in there. One of the other things I just wanted to touch on, because I know it comes up regularly when I'm dealing with various different people, is New Zealand. They're slightly nutty over there, but it's okay. But one of the things that became quite evident is the cost of meth and meth contamination, particularly in the public housing sector, was quite significant. And what it meant was that they really wanted to be able to deal with this better. They actually, cutting a very long story short, they dealt with it quite badly at the start. They ended up with a huge bill and a lot of vacant houses that they couldn't deal with. So they started off with a guideline of 0.5, the same as ours. Last year they moved up to 1.5, and then less than this year they came up with a report that said for sites that have been contaminated by use, 15's awesome. Let's go with that. It meant that a lot of their properties they could keep renting out to people, and it meant they didn't have to evict people. So is that the right solution? Just give it a higher number? No. International levels all sit up to maximum is 1.5, so they're sort of out by themselves. How do we separate use and manufacture? Most of the time we don't know. Should the guidelines be any different? They're based on the toxicity of methamphetamine. Is it any different? Is the effects you get from alcohol any different whether you drink the same amount at a pub or at home? I mean, really, it's no different. It's the same thing. As far as the guidelines are concerned, how did they get such a big number? Well, I used that Colorado number from the animal studies because it gave them a bigger number. And you know those uncertainty factors they talked about? You don't need those. Get rid of them. So, you know, they're safety factors. We don't need that safety in there. So that's what they did to come up with a bigger number. Would we do this for any other contaminant where, you know, big government and big business is responsible for it? No. Where homeowners and very cash-poor housing authorities were coming up with this sort of approach. So, and we do know that we've got evidence of harm in that range of 2 to 15. So, really, it's really not a good idea. Bunch of gaps that we still need to fill. We still need to learn more. We still need to do more. That's just part of what we continue to do. And I'm done.
Okay. Thank you for that. I was going to ask you for a round of applause for Jackie, but you took it upon yourself to do that. So what we thought now, we're aware that probably people are itching in the audience to ask questions, probably for a good reason. But first we thought we'd have a panel discussion from a number of experts in the field. And I'd like to call our experts to come up and take their seat. Firstly, Mr. Greg Troughton, if you could come and join us. Greg is from the Real Estate Institute of South Australia. And then Alice Wiley from the City of Onkaparinga, and also Michaela Hobby from South Australian Health, the state government department. And I was just about to say that because of the activity we've had in South Australia in the last 24 hours and in the last 2 hours, we were going to have representation from Forensic Science South Australia, who do all the clandestine drug lab investigation in South Australia. The member from FSSA got called out around about an hour ago, literally. So standing in Ben Painter's stead is Dr. Anne Coxon, and Anne is probably uniquely qualified actually to sit on the panel. And this is great because Anne's investigated many clandestine laboratories in her lifetime before she came to South Australia, in New Zealand of all places. Yes. So Anne's had involvement with the development of clan labs in New Zealand. I think we both attended the first big clan lab in New Zealand many years ago. And since then the situation has grown and the response to clan labs has grown in New Zealand. So thank you, Anne, for joining us at the last moment.
No problem. demonstration or anything?
Yes, I'll ask you the questions that are appropriate. And also, in the remainder of the audience, there are other experts from Forensic Science South Australia who get involved with investigation of drug offences and also other allied areas, including biology. I see biologists in the audience. So we're joined by a number of experts from the forensic science profession. So first off, we might sort of get the panel session going. Can we have some lights back on, if that's possible? Maybe. Yeah, we're about to get some lights. We might have to move around a bit to get them to come on. Okay, thank you. So thank you for joining us anyway. And maybe first off, we should possibly examine the scope of methamphetamine firstly, and its use and abuse in South Australia, because that is mainly what is driving the clandestine drug laboratory industry in Australia. So firstly, Anne, if we can spring the first question on you without notice and with surprise. Methamphetamine, is it a big drug in South Australia?
Yeah, that's correct. And as Jackie's already mentioned, is that it's now moved to be more smoky, and that's in its pure form and its crystalline form known as ice. Huge demand for it. Demand has increased. I don't know whether you've seen recently, there was some information in news about SA water, looking at wastewater and the amount of methamphetamine there, and the use has actually increased.
Right. And I guess it's the case that the methamphetamine all comes from clandestine drug labs. It's not actually pharmaceutical material.
It's not pharmaceutical material, but some of it will be from a lab that's been imported.
Yes.
Although we do have some that's made here as well.
So as I alluded to, there was a big clan lab yesterday in Adelaide and possibly another one today. So it's obviously not just a phenomenon from Melbourne and Sydney. We do have manufacture happening in South Australia, that's correct.
That's correct. And this year, as you saw on the graph that was up there, we've got a slight trend of increases. We were up at 81, I think you said it was last year.
Yeah.
And we're certainly on track to hit that again this year, whereas in the few years beforehand, it's been slightly less, maybe 50 or 60 and around that sort of area. So it is on a slight increase.
Yeah, so we're talking greater than one per week, effectively.
At the moment.
And they're laboratories that are being uncovered and the police visit and maybe some charges laid and what have you after that event.
Yes, that's correct.
And Jackie, you had some figures that maybe that's the tip of the iceberg. What an appalling pun for the number of clan labs that's out there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that's the statistics we know. It comes from what police sees, so we can only know what they bust. But certainly, all indications are that that's around the 5 to 10% of what's really out there, and it's all those properties that we don't know, which are the troublesome ones, because no one knows that they were there. Though I have to say, if you go talk to your neighbours, they've got a pretty good idea. So, but yeah, it's the ones that aren't busted by police that are flying under the radar.
Yes, yes. So between yourselves, Anne and yourself, Jackie, do there tend to be any hallmarks for clan labs? Do they tend to be in affluent areas, more deprived areas, country, metropolitan?
Well, let me tell you.
First.
Put this on. There we go. Is that working? I attended a lot of laboratories in New Zealand, somewhere in the region of 800 to 900 over the years, and we were everywhere. We were in the high-class suburbs. We were in houses that were worth multi-million-dollar. We were in the back end of beyond of nowhere, where you wouldn't want to buy a house for more than $5,000. We were in hotels, motels, sheds, cars, camper vans. They're everywhere, quite frankly. You couldn't pick where they were going to be.
Right.
So I'd agree with that. Yeah,
yep, okay.
Absolutely.
So we're trying to draw the distinction, as Jackie did in her talk, between properties where methamphetamine is made, so factories, if you like, as distinct from places where people smoke it, so where the end users are using the material. Sometimes they're one and the same. Sometimes they will smoke their own products, but there are certainly two levels of operation that I guess we need to be careful of and we need to know about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, that we see contamination from both of those. And it's, you can't just easily, because you can't see the contamination in these properties because they still look the same, they're neat and tidy or whatever else, there's no real signs. You can't tell whether it was use or manufacture. Sometimes it's really obvious that it is manufactured because you get really screamingly high numbers. They're the no-brainers. But there's a whole bunch that sit around that, sort of 5 to 20 plus range that you don't know if it's manufacture of a small amount or if it was used by a lot of people. You just don't know. So it's really hard to distinguish that.
Right, okay.
Just to add on to that, I know that study that you quoted, Jackie, around looking at the amount of methamphetamine that comes from one smoke. That one smoke, I'm assuming, was 100 milligrams?
I have to go back and check. I can't remember.
I think it was and that's the normal smoke. It's called a point. Point bag. Maybe 1 or 2 smokes in there. We had addicts in New Zealand who, quite a few of them, it was quite a high percentage that were smoking between 1 and 2 grams a day. So not just your 1 point bag that some people that'll last them a weekend and they call themselves a meth user. And we had some that were higher than that. So instantly you've got above those 25 smokes very quickly in your one area.
Yeah, and that's where you start getting those higher residue levels in some of those properties that we use. And again, we've only got one study that's done that. It would be great to have more to actually see what's going on.
And to put that into perspective, the typical dose, if you were trying to cure, for want of a bit, ADHD or something of that nature, or use it for weight control, is you order about 15 to 20 milligrams per day for an adult. So the numbers you quote, grams a day, is actually pretty horrifying as far as the amount is concerned. Bring in some of our other guests now if we can. Michaela and Alice, can you walk us through the process? I was going to ask a representative from SAPOL for their point of view as to what happens at Clan Labs. Obviously the police investigate when they are given advice that there's been a Clan Lab in operation, and they will of course secure the scene and collect evidence and what have you. But thereafter there are other responsibilities, and you might be interested to know why we have a local government representative on the panel. So if we can find out from both our state and local government representatives as to what happens once a lab is discovered.
So basically we get notified by the police, and that will consist of a report that will let us know information on the extent of the Clan Lab. We will then immediately put a notice on that property which stops any occupancy of that property, and then we'll liaise with the owner and carry out the testing and the remediation. So it's the owner's responsibility to contact a suitable hygienist to carry out that. We then put that notice on the Section 7 searches, so if you go to buy the property, it will pop up, so you don't have what happened in Victoria happened, and you'll be notified that obviously there's a notice on the property. Then once the remediation is done, we actually insist that it gets tested again to make sure that it's safe for people to enter, and the notice would then be taken off the property, so you will never get notified.
In 2016, we introduced the South Australian Public Health Clandestine Drug Lab Policy, and that really provides a legislative framework to enable the work that Alice has described to take place. So we also receive notification by SAPOL when a laboratory is identified, and I have to thank Jackie because she contributed to, I think, the belts and braces approach that we have in South Australia, where at SA Health's level we're also using the South Australian Land Information System to flag properties that have unremediated laboratories identified on them, and we also share that information with Housing SA, who also go through that process. So we have 3 independent statutory authorities flagging these properties, which virtually eliminates the risk of a property being unwittingly sold with an unremediated laboratory on it. And I also have to thank Jackie for providing me with a scientific rationale why I shouldn't be vacuuming at home, so thank you.
So is that a general tip, is it? Or So that's the robust situation that you were talking about that's in operation here and WA.
Yeah, WA's got a very similar system. So, they've got a good system of picking up those properties that are busted by police. There is still a gap on how you deal with those properties that aren't busted by police. I was quite heartened to see that particular case study that was in South Australia where it wasn't busted by police, but they still gave the hygienist's report to the council, and the council still issued a notice, which was great. It would be good if that continued, but there's no way actually getting that done. The other states are various different forms of things happening. Some of them are basket cases, some of them are a little bit more switched on. So it would be good if we can get them up to speed.
Right. And Greg, if I could bring you in at this point, you're sort of caught between legislative frameworks and buyers and sellers. Is there
Yes. Yes.
is there a need to go further or need to go back?
There is a need to go further. Everybody has a right to live in a home where they're buying or leasing. The house has to be fit for purpose, and clearly, when it's been impacted, I guess manufacture is easy, and we rely on those robust processes. The use is a separate issue, but Jackie, I love the way you dealt with the New Zealand example. I had all of my fellow CEOs here in September of last year, and we actually played the chief scientist from New Zealand saying a naked child can run around the house and crawl everywhere and they would be fine. And of course, we all sat there and went, well, that's just solved our problem. That's fantastic. And then within a week of that, we were told, well, the New Zealand government was about to bequeath $40 million worth of property and they didn't want to have to test them all, so they just did that. So all of a sudden it became back into question again. So what are the real estate institutes doing? We've actually written formally to the chief scientist and the chief medical officer of Australia, and we're seeking some guidance. There's plenty of guidance already, but I guess the New Zealand incident sort of gave us because it comes down to liability. I mean, the couple of samples you've mentioned up here, one, a real estate agent knowingly and deceptively not sharing that information, throw the book at them. It's as simple as that. In terms of the real estate agent that was involved in the manufacture, well, I don't have too many nice words to say about that, but maybe it's too easy to become a real estate agent, and we need to discuss that.
Why they all drive Porsches.
That's exactly right.
I was going to say maybe you just don't pay them enough.
Well, yeah, okay, I won't comment on that one. Anyway, the New Zealand situation, we thought it helped us, but it hasn't. It's actually hindered us. And the real question comes down to a real estate agent or a property manager making a judgment call, and they might go, well, Jackie, you actually look like someone that might, use and abuse, drugs, so therefore we need to have the place tested. I guess the question is, where is that line drawn? And I guess we're seeking some more guidance on that. As I say, from the federal government at the moment, we've got we don't really know. So the one good grace in South Australia is this Section 7 Form 1 document. Whilst it's a huge, cumbersome document, if you're buying the property, the purchaser's conveyancer will see the notification and can bring the whole process to an end until it's remediated. So there are some processes, but some stronger guidelines, and this goes a long, long way, but there are still some grey areas, and it's when an agent knows or ought to know. So what's that ought to know, and when does it become their legal liability? If they know, as I say, it's straightforward. It's if they ought to know, and does the smoking apparatus on the floor as they enter in? My argument would be, well, I think you should test the place. And again, we're talking about use here. Manufacturer, I think, is a clear case that it needs to be tested.
Yes, and that's the distinction to take home, isn't it? That at the moment there may be properties that are undiscovered as clan labs, but probably many more where meth has been smoked.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's become very much a recreational use in the sewage studies and all of those sorts of things. So one of our frustrations is that every time we see something in the paper about this issue, generally there's a product being pushed. And so we're actually working with some of the companies that aren't out there trying to scare in order to try and find a solution to this, because, as I said, I can guarantee you there is not a decent, hard-working real estate agent out there that wants to put a family into a home that could cause these wellness or unwellness effects.
Yes.
Can I just add, in relation to the situation in Australia, the guidelines we have is 0.5. It's not going to change. What's going on in New Zealand relates to New Zealand.
Yes.
So as far as applying it here, you need to apply the Australian guidelines. That is also, I suppose, endorsed with the in-health position statement that came out, which also talks that applies for both manufacture and use. So that's quite clearly stated here that applies for both. Now, as far as how you pick properties that deal with that may be contaminated or not, how do you risk assess those, which ones you test? I know this is probably one of your questions, but jumping the gun a little bit.
Yeah, answer it. I was going to ask it, yes.
I personally believe you can't tell. Many of these properties you can't pick. And the amount of harm that can happen from being put into one of these properties, I think a very simple test for $100 or less than $100 to prevent this happening would be of great benefit regardless.
So you're an advocate for testing everywhere, even though we don't know, as you said, it goes from the wealthy suburbs, could be an Unley, all the way out to Happy Valley, down to Elizabeth. So you'd be an advocate of that?
Yep, I've got case studies, like I say, I've got a family that completely lost their entire home and life savings. I've got other people who've got multi-million-dollar properties, they can't live in them. Could have been prevented by doing one simple test for $100. That would have told them that it's got contamination present, whether it's high, low, medium, but whatever it was contamination present, they would never have bought that property.
Well, I guess we have a fundamental issue, and it's the same with every real estate institute representing real estate agents, and that is it's only under very exceptional circumstances where we want to get in the way of a willing purchaser with a willing seller. I can name two right now. One is obviously a swimming pool. They need to be certified. They need to make sure that we don't have that unthinkable, death by drowning. Smoke alarms is another classic example. I suspect, and for all the property managers that may well listen to this into the future, I suspect this may well be the third issue, whereby the luxury of either being able to sell a home because you're in that position, or the luxury of being able to rent a home because you're fortunate enough to be in that position, it may well be that an obligation follows, that happens. At the moment, it's all about cost and who pays for it.
Yes.
And it's very easy to duck shove that onto the government, but it's a discussion we need to have.
Yes, and that was going to be my next question. So if the testing is as simple as, as cheap as $100, that's one thing, but then who is responsible to pay that?
I would have thought that, $100 to basically make a representation to the world that I'm selling a home and it's meth free might be a positive marketplace thing that might be picked up. Similarly, come and rent this place, we can give you a guarantee because we've had it tested. I guess because every time we have a conversation with somebody and because there's something in the Times or news or wherever it is, generally there's a company pushing a product. I guess we're just remaining sceptical about what the right test might be. There's a couple of swab processes here in Adelaide that we're working very closely with, but again, who pays for it?
Yes, yes. And I guess one of the other issues is we're focused quite heavily on methamphetamine here, which is our number one illicit drug. But I think Anne and Jackie could also indicate that there are other drugs that are manufactured in Australia, not the least of which being ecstasy. There are other labs out there, aren't there, that would not give a positive to a meth test?
That's exactly right. And so there's obviously the ecstasy type drugs, the fantasy, the GBL type drugs. A lot of different drugs are manufactured illicitly. But also in addition to that, you may not pick up methamphetamine, but then as Jackie alluded to, there's all the chemicals involved as well. Now they're going to cause contamination. Most chemical spillages will probably leave some sort of staining you might notice, but not all of them, particularly if it's seeped into carpets and it's a clear liquid or a powder that hasn't fully been collected away. So it's not just the methamphetamine. Different drugs and other chemicals could be causing some of that contamination.
And I think the figure is that for every 1 kilogram of meth produced in a lab, clan lab that is, there's around about 6 to 10 kilograms of waste that's produced.
Yeah, I've never known where that figure's come from, but it is something that's been known throughout the community for about 20 years. Yeah. Everybody quotes it, but certainly there is a lot of waste material, correct?
That's right. And depending on the method, as Jackie alluded to, there's a number of methods that are used. Yeah.
And the cooks are really quite creative about where they put that waste too. So you'd be surprised at what you find in industrial or other waste bins. They'll put it in whatever containers and put it in somebody else's bin because it's a great way of getting rid of it. So
Yes.
you'll never know where it ends up. They're quite creative.
Yes, so one test might not really address the
Well, that's one of the issues that we're working with at the moment. I mean, meth happens to be the flavour of the month.
Yes.
And I know you
Yes.
worked hard, Jackie, so it will continue being the flavour, but there's a whole host of health issues. And so we can find a test that someone that's been suitably trained in an ideal world, a property manager, that can be trained, accredited, and do whatever it is they need to do in order to get the test back. Is it a green light? It's okay. And again, it may well be that 0.1 micrograms per 100 centimetres may well cause somebody that is of a heightened health sensitivity some issues. So again, it's horses for courses.
That's right. And then the unknown toxicological effects of byproducts and other things is an unknown question at the moment.
If I can just add to that.
Sure.
From SA Health perspective, we're notified of all clandestine drug labs by SAPOL that fit category A, B and C according to the guidelines. But increasingly we are seeing notification of manufacture and reprocessing of other drugs, including fantasy, ephedra and the like. And I think one of the issues that we're also contemplating is the presence of fentanyl coming into the country and being reprocessed, and I think we're not quite prepared for that at the moment. We have produced guidelines for local government environmental health officers and the community on how to respond to clan labs that are reported where other drugs have been detected, and we've worked closely with our toxicologists to pick out some basic parameters. We're looking for acids, heavy metals and the like. So there is some basic guidance there to help you out in that regard.
Yes, that sort of answers my next question, that I think most people would have heard of the so-called new psychoactive substances that are on the market and make it into the news. They don't tend to be manufactured here so much, but there can be tableting operations and other operations that take place in suburban dwellings as well.
Yep. We're looking particularly at fentanyl and carfentanil at the moment.
Yes.
Which is, you only need very small quantities to produce toxic effects. And again, it's likely to be imported.
Yes.
And it's an issue that the Public Health Services is actively working on at the moment.
Yeah. In order to alarm people, the amount of residues that Jackie was talking about per square, 10 square centimetres, that would be almost a lethal overdose for some of these fentanyls. So it's not a matter of finding micrograms per square centimetre, it's picograms per square centimetre. So they're very, very potent materials, but fortunately not a major concern in Australia, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Can I just, add to that? So I actually had a case that was fentanyl related, and they were actually crushing the powder and using nasal sprays, and the fumes from the spray actually contaminated the property. It was under the 0.5, but it was like 0.4 or something like that. So there is a chance that obviously there was no cooking or anything involved or smoking, and that the house was still contaminated potentially.
So I think what the panel was saying is really it's a very, very multi-pronged problem, isn't it, that requires a fairly nuanced approach for everybody concerned.
It is. And can I just add, with all the various different other drugs that are out there, one of the challenges is having labs, commercial labs that can actually detect these. A lot of them are geared up for looking for methamphetamine, amphetamine, ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, but a lot of them don't carry the standards and don't look for any of these other drugs that are there. So you may well have properties that are contaminated with these other drugs, but getting a lab that can do it commercially as opposed to what police might use and have access to is sometimes the biggest challenge is actually being able to find it.
Yes, and for people, if they wish to do the testing themselves or contract it themselves, it's far easier to find somebody than go to the police for it.
Yes.
That's for sure, yes, okay. So I think it's, thank you very much for your participation and the discussion. We'd now like to open up to the floor if you're willing to answer questions from the floor, and I'm sure there may be some people here who wish to ask a question. Yes.
What does remediation involve? Like, is it washing, vacuuming, cleaning doesn't work.
You could have a whole another
relevant.
forum on remediation. Very quickly, it depends on the level of contamination that's present. It can range from essentially just giving the walls a good scrub to demolishing the house. So there's ranges of things that happen in between. That Victorian house is going to be demolished. There's other ones where they get stripped out of their gyprock. There's other ones that can be successfully remediated with a good scrub of all the surfaces and replacing soft furnishings. Soft furnishings are really difficult, but get rid of those, the hard surfaces being scrubbed. So that's the range that are there. There's a whole range of methods that haven't been really well validated or confirmed how well they work. And like you say, apart from the testing, there's also remediation companies that are pushing all sorts of weird and wonderfuls, which we really need to learn more about. And that's part of some of future research is understanding what's effective for different types of levels.
I've seen some costs upwards of $30,000 or $40,000 for a house to be remediated, and I understand there's only one landlord insurance product that would cover that. In terms of you want to talk about costs. The best thing to do is pay the $350 a year if you're fortunate enough to own a property that you're leasing, then at least you're covered in that regard.
Question, if you just wait for the microphone, because we're live streaming here.
He gives that
Well,
landlord's
they don't
insurance.
sponsor the Real Estate Institute, so I'm not going to mention it, but we can talk about it afterwards. It's being recorded.
Just another question about...
Oh, that's okay. I had a question about how long ago the meth lab had to have existed for the residue effects to still be there. So is it 10 years, 30 years ago?
Oh, look, we don't know. Certainly the case studies I've got, we've been following up for quite a number of years and they haven't gone anywhere if they haven't been remediated. So that Victorian case study, what we're measuring today is exactly the same that was measured back in 2014. I've got another case study that the manufacture occurred 10 years ago and they've got up to 240 in their house now. We don't know what was there when they started with, but it's still highly contaminated. We just don't know. We haven't done enough research over enough length of time on different types of properties